Welcome. Today is Thursday, July 22nd, 2021. We are in the text on chapter 4, section 7. It's page 69 in the book. And this section is entitled Creation and Communication. It is clear that while the content of any particular ego illusion does not matter, its correction is more helpful in a specific context. Ego illusions are quite specific, although the mind is naturally abstract. Part of the mind becomes concrete, however, when it splits. The concrete part believes in the ego because the ego depends on the concrete. The ego is the part of the mind that believes your existence is defined by separation. Everything the ego perceives is a separate whole, without the relationships that imply being. The ego is thus against communication, except insofar as it is utilized to establish separateness rather than to abolish it. The communication system of the ego is based on its own thought system and is everything else it dictates. Its communication is controlled by its need to project itself, and it will disrupt communication when it experiences threat. This disruption is a reaction to a specific person or persons. The specificity of the ego's thinking, then, results in spurious generalization, which is really not abstract at all. It merely responds in certain specific ways to everything it perceives as related. Well, let's go over that again. Ego illusions are quite specific. So we see that a lot in, the nature of the ego world that we live in. We have, a lot of science that wants to go down to the nitty-gritty, to the microcosm, and define everything and give everything a name and figure out how it works. And so there's a lot of specificity in the illusion. But then it says the mind is naturally abstract. The mind in itself is abstract. If the mind wasn't split, which created the ego mind, then it would just be abstract unto itself. But part of the mind becomes concrete when it splits. So we split our own mind by thinking we could separate ourselves from our Father, from Spirit, and so that's what made the split, that separation, just that thought of separating created the split, which created the ego. And the ego, having been born in an abstract mind, nonetheless becomes a concrete mind. And the concrete part believes in the ego. Well, of course, the ego believes in itself. The ego depends on the concrete. It depends on all of the specificity of all of the minute little details. And that's what basically keeps us separated. You know, in the abstract mind of spirit, there's only one of us. There is no separation. There is no split. So the ego is the part of the mind that believes your existence is defined by separation, whereas the spirit is the part of the mind that believes your existence is defined by oneness. Any questions? Comments? Yes, Eileen.
So, and I understand this correctly, when we were all one, it was just the one thought. There was just one. So the thought spun us off into this ego-based world, right?
It was a specific thought. It was the thought that we could separate ourselves from spirit.
Right. So we were all one when we had that thought. So that thought theoretically was happening to everybody. I understand there's like technically no everybody if we're all one, but for
Right.
points of discussion.
Yeah.
Okay. So the one thought, we were all one. So that thought, it only took the one to have that thought, to have it happen to everybody. Right. So theoretically, if we all simultaneously had the thought, we can't separate, it could undo it.
Yes.
Okay. So that's just a thought of mine. That's just the way that my brain works. So the other question that I have is this idea that in order to love unconditionally and in order to, be loving all the time, ideally, you have to love yourself first. So if I'm going to love myself first, am I separate, or is that just what you're stuck with in this realm?
You don't have to love yourself first. What Jesus said, love God and love yourself as your neighbor. The Course teaches us that the way to salvation is through our brothers. That by seeing ourselves as one with our brothers will get us there. Loving our brothers will get us there. Because loving someone else is loving yourself. So don't try to think of the solution in ego terms.
So it's not true that I will sort of be better at offering love to my brothers and sisters if I have a sense of loving myself. That's not true.
Well, I'm not going to say that's not true. I'm going to say that the way you think about it, if you say, I love myself first, then that separates you from everybody else. And so that's a separation thought. The ideal thought is, I love all. There's only one of us, so I just love all. I'm loving myself, I'm loving my brother, I'm loving the trees, I'm loving the dogs. It's all, the allness.
Okay.
Does
Okay.
that make sense? Thinking in spiritual terms instead of ego terms.
Yeah, I would almost just say, I'm not even sure I need the word all. I might just be thinking, I love.
Yes,
That's it.
yeah, that works.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes,
John,
David.
I just say, I am love.
There you go.
But I noticed the ego keeps popping up. Like I noticed the other day, I was every place I turned, there were people with dark skin. But I said to myself right away, that's ego. Let go of that. We're all one.
Yes.
But it has to do with, for me, it has to do with consciousness and being aware of ego thoughts and then letting them go and think loving thoughts.
Yes. Yeah. Ideally, whenever you look at somebody who's different from you, you look at them and say, oh, there I am. Oh, there I am. Oh, look at me over there. Oh, now I'm over there. Like everywhere I look, I see myself.
I see love.
There you go. Okay, let's.
You really can't help. I can't help slipping into ego, but
Well,
and then I pull myself back.
yeah, we all do that. That's the thing. We're all, involved in this process of realizing we've slipped into ego and pulling ourselves back. And it keeps happening over and over again. But the more you pull yourself back, the easier it becomes and the less likely you are to fall into ego traps because you're becoming more and more conscious of it. Right?
Right.
So I'm going to mute you all and I'm going to go back to paragraph 2. And let's look at this paragraph again. Everything the ego perceives is a separate whole. So the ego sees me, David, Eileen, Helene. They're separate wholes. Without the relationship that implies being, because being is just oneness, the I am. So ego is thus against communication, where everybody is looking at everybody else and communicating that the oneness, except insofar as it is utilized to establish separateness. So it wants to communicate separateness. The ego does not want the separateness to be abolished. The communication system of the ego is based on its own thought system. It's not based on spiritual thought system, as is everything else it dictates. The ego has its own thought system, which is a system of separation. Its communication is controlled by its need to protect itself because the ego always feels threatened. Ego's always ready to fight, to protect itself, and it will disrupt communication when it experiences threat. That's why some people have a hard time coming into the spiritual life because that old thing about why do bad things happen to good people? Well, my mother used to say the devil made her do it, but I'm saying the ego made you do it. The ego is always going to try to sabotage somebody who's trying to work its way out of ego and into spirit. So it will disrupt communication when it experiences threat. This disruption is a reaction to a specific person or persons. Usually things happen from other people, although sometimes we do it to ourselves, but somebody makes us mad. Somebody insulted us. So somebody did this, somebody did that, the blame game, always blaming other people for this, blaming other people for that. That's just so ego. That's what ego does, playing that blame game. There was a saying I saw on Facebook, some Oriental philosopher, I forget, went something like, he who blames others has a long way to go. He who blames himself is halfway there. He who blames no one has reached the goal. Yeah. Stop blaming. Go ahead, Eileen.
Okay, so I know that, so this is kind of like just the tricky part, right? So that's like super easy if somebody insults you or, you're just like, your ego bruised. And I know you're not supposed to allow yourself to be harmed, right? So like, let's say we're not talking about something as simple as somebody said something insulting to me, but somebody's actually hurting me, physical abuse, whatever. So I'm sure I'm not supposed to stay in that situation, right? Somebody, God forbid, is in a situation where they're literally their life's at stake, their life's threatened.
Right.
But what do you mentally do? Like, I understand you would leave. Ideally, you would leave. You would not allow that. But what do you do with that in the face of this idea?
You forgive them.
So you leave and you forgive them.
Yeah.
Okay.
You see them as being a spiritual person, and you forgive them not because they did anything wrong, but because they're completely innocent. They're spiritual beings. They are not doing anything to you. They are you. It's the ego that's doing that to you, and the ego is an illusion. You have to wrap your mind around it in that way. No matter what harm may befall you, the spirit is not going to harm anybody anyway, anytime. But the ego person will try to harm you. But that's why you have to forgive them spiritually, by recognizing that, there's only one of you. So if someone's attacking you, you're basically attacking yourself, and you're not in your right mind. You're in the ego mind. And so you have to send that love of yourself to yourself, and forgiveness, because the person's not really doing that, not the spiritual person, and rise above it all. It's a hard concept to wrap your mind around. But the other thing I want to say about this, in just a minute, David, I see your hand, is that, this comes up so often. This is like one of the prime examples. Well, what are you going to do if somebody's raping your mother? It's just, or what are you going to do if somebody's shooting at you with a gun? But you know what? These hypothetical situations rarely occur in real life. I mean, when was the last time some stranger came up in the street and started beating on you? Or some stranger came up and started raping your daughter or your mother or something like this. These extreme examples, they're just so hypothetical. And I mean, as a Quaker, we get the same thing because we believe in nonviolence. And, well, what are you going to do if well, you know what? There were plenty of Quaker conscientious objectors during World War I and II, and those were real ego situations where people actually were shooting at you and bombing at you and what have you. But nonetheless, those people said, no, I will not lift my hand in violence. What the other person does, that's their decision, but I don't have to respond in kind. And so, that's.
I just want to sort of level the playing field a little bit because I worked at a women's shelter. It was not as uncommon. You're right, a stranger, jumping out of an alley in the street with a gun is very unlikely. Domestic violence, not so much. So it didn't feel like this really out there example. Because, like I said, I worked at a women's shelter. We used to hide women and children from the abusive husband and father and, collect clothing and things for them and toiletries to set them up in places where they hopefully could not be found. One of the most frustrating parts, of course, which is just an aside, is more often than not, the women went back, which would break all our hearts. But, I'm not really talking about something as extremely unlikely as a stranger, jumping out of an alleyway with a gun. For me, it doesn't feel that remote.
Yes, and I understand that, and I do acknowledge that in our society, a lot of those abusive situations do occur, and there are places in the world and where there actually is warfare and fighting and people being shot at and killed, and there's certainly plenty of racism here in the United States. There's a lot of mental and emotional violence as well as physical violence that is occurring. And all that I can say in response to that is that, yes, this is ego fighting. This is ego fighting. And that is why the true solution to all the ego fighting can only be spiritual awareness. The people who are doing the ego fighting and being the ego victims need to find their way out of that into a spiritual awareness, because we all create our own reality. And when you're thinking with spiritual thoughts, you're creating a spiritual reality for yourself. When you're thinking with ego thoughts, you're creating an ego reality for yourself. And so the deeper and deeper you go into the ego thinking, the deeper and deeper you are into the ego situations.
Okay.
And
John, could I chime in? Oh, I'm sorry.
yes, go ahead, Helene.
I just wanted to add some substance and figures to what Eileen has said, because I too have the opportunity, the great opportunity, to help people who are in need. And Here's the statistics. Children 14 to 17 years old in the United States, 28% of them have been sexually abused. That's over a quarter of children ages 14 to 17 have been sexually abused. It's not, if that's ego, if that's terrible ego, then we got a long way to go before we get to a point where we're all safe.
Yes. And I understand that, and I know the statistics are high, and worldwide it's probably even worse than that, because there's still human slavery in the world. There's kids being snatched and used as sex slaves in countries, and including in the United States and all. There's a lot of very terrible things that are happening. I'm not trying to diminish any of that, or just ignore it or wipe it away. I do understand all of that, but what I'm trying to concentrate on is that what can you do? What can I do? What can we do individually to cope with those situations? And the fact of the matter is that I personally cannot have any control over all of that abuse and violence except within myself. And so I have to concentrate on what I can do. And I can meditate, I can pray, I can send love mentally, spiritually to these people. Again, in the Quakerism, every week after we finish our meeting for worship, we ask, are there any concerns to be held in the light? And people bring up these issues. And so we all sit there collectively and hold these people in the light. The only true solution to what I'm saying is that the only true solutions to all of these problems in the world are spiritual solutions. Those are the only true solutions. Anything you try to do in ego, you may fix something over here, but it'll mushroom up over there. You may go try to stop the leak here, but then a new leak breaks out there, because that's what ego does. But a spiritual solution that sheds light and love and forgiveness will dissipate the ego completely. And that's what we're trying to learn how to do. By studying A Course in Miracles, we're trying to learn how to be the light workers in the world, to bring the light of spirit into the world so that ego will be diminished and these terrible things will stop happening. It's a big goal. Yes, David, you've been so patient. Go ahead.
Well, for me, what I try to do, and it's a very difficult thing, is to have compassion for the victim and the perpetrator, both, because we are all one. Usually when I bring up this point, people don't like to hear it, but when what made the perpetrator like that, what is, and they need a little compassion because of maybe their upbringing or their mental disease or whatever it is. We have to have compassion is a very strong emotion, which is from the spirit, and we have to have compassion for ourselves. Compassion all the ways around. I'll give a dose to everybody. It really works for me, and I feel less angry, less hurt when I'm feeling compassion for everybody. And the problems can't be solved if we don't have, if we throw people in jail, and it's just more hurt and more anger, and it doesn't solve problems. I wish I could express it more clearly than that, but this is what works for me.
Thank you, David. And yes, compassion is also part of loving and forgiving. So let's go on to paragraph 3. In contrast to the ego, spirit reacts in the same way to everything it knows is true and does not respond at all to anything else, nor does it make any attempt to establish what is true. It knows that what is true is everything that God created. It is complete and direct communication. It is in complete and direct communication with every aspect of creation. Because it is in complete and direct communication with its creator. This communication is the will of God. Creation and communication are synonymous. God created every mind by communicating his mind to it, thus establishing it forever as a channel for the reception of his mind and will. Since only beings of a like order can truly communicate, his creations naturally communicate with him and like him. This communication is perfectly abstract, since its quality is universal in application and not subject to any judgment, any exception, or any alteration. God creates you by this and for this. God created you by this and for this. The mind can distort its function, but it cannot endow itself with functions it was not given. That is why the mind cannot totally lose the ability to communicate, even though it may refuse to utilize it on behalf of being. Anyone? So spirit only knows what is true. And what is true is what God created and is in the will of God. And we are his creations. And so our true selves are the creation of God. And our true minds are a part of his mind. And our true wills are a part of his will. Because there's only one of us. So the spiritual mind is a oneness, whereas the ego mind is a split and specific and separate and has all kinds of iterations to it. Paragraph 4. Existence as well as being rest on communication. Existence, however, is specific in how, what, and with whom communication is judged to be worth undertaking. Being is completely without these distinctions. It is a state in which the mind is in communication with everything that is real. To whatever extent you permit this state to be curtailed, you are limiting your sense of your own reality, which becomes total only by recognizing all reality in the glorious context of its real relationship to you. This is your reality. Do not desecrate it or recoil from it. It is your real home, your real temple, and your real self. So being is completely without distinctions, spiritual being. It is a state in which mind is in communication with everything that is real, and what is real is only spirit. To whatever extent you permit this state to be curtailed, you are limiting your own sense of reality. So if you're thinking with the ego mind, you're limiting your own sense of reality, your spiritual reality. So the idea here is to recognize your true reality, your spiritual reality. Do not desecrate it or recoil from it. It is your real home, your real temple, your real self, your spiritual self. Paragraph 5. God, who encompasses all being, created beings who have everything individually, but who want to share it to increase their joy. Nothing real can be increased except by sharing. This is why God created you. Divine abstraction takes joy in sharing. That is what creation means. How, what, and to whom are irrelevant, because real creation gives everything, since it can create only like itself. Remember that in the kingdom, there is no difference between having and being as there is in existence. In the state of being, the mind gives everything always. So God extended himself to create us. He shared himself. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be extending ourselves and sharing ourselves to all that is, and as just as our Father did. Remember that in the kingdom of heaven, there is no difference between having and being as there is in the ego existence. In ego existence, there's a big difference between having and being, but not in spirit. In the state of being, the mind gives everything always. Any thoughts?
Could you explain that differently?
Explain.
Everything you read there, it didn't, the being and the having, and it didn't sink in. I don't know, it's the words for me, I guess.
All righty. Well, let's go over it again then. God encompasses all of being. And all beings who have everything individually, but who want to share it to increase their joy. So Again, here we're caught up in language because we're using ego language to communicate these ideas. So things like having everything is an ego idea. Individually is an ego idea. Wanting to share it to increase their joy, those are ego ideas. So it has to use these words to communicate with us. But basically what it's saying is that God encompasses all of being, and all of being has everything, and all of being shares everything to increase the joy of all of being. Because there is, in reality, no individuals. There's only one of us. So nothing real can be increased except by sharing. So that's the thing about, what is real is all of good, is all of love, is all of peace, all of compassion. All of this, what is real, the only way you can increase what is real is by sharing it, by spreading it out. And he says, that is why God created you. God wanted to share all of his goodness. And so he spread himself out. And that is how we became created. And that is why we, or I, the one of us, how the one of us got created and why the one of us got created. Because God wanted to share his goodness, share his joy, share his love. And in that sharing creates more love, creates more joy. Divine abstraction takes joy in sharing. It creates more of it. And the sentence 5 says, that is what creation means, is the sharing of love and joy, the sharing of all that is real and all of what is God. And the how, what, and to whom are irrelevant because those are ego concepts. God doesn't see how, what, and whom. God just is. It just is. And there's only one of us. And he shares his joy and love. Real creation gives everything, since it can create only like itself. God can't create anything that is not like itself, like himself, itself. The oneness cannot create anything that is not like the oneness. In the oneness, there's no difference between having and being. Because it just is. It's the isness. In the state of being, the mind gives everything always. In the state of God's being, the mind is always giving everything, always. Go ahead, David.
So, thank you for that explanation. I think the joy comes from this, our joy. I was thinking how earlier Eileen, Helene, and both John and myself were people who work in the oneness, help people and are in service and not looking for, to fill the ego or fill our pockets doing this type of work. And that is, that's where our reward, I think, is probably the joy of being in the oneness, in the spirit. And that's how I interpret that. I didn't understand it at all before you started explaining it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else before we move on? Paragraph 6. The Bible repeatedly states that you should praise God. This hardly means that you should tell him how wonderful he is. He has no ego with which to accept such praise, and no perception with which to judge it. But unless you take your part in the creation, his joy is not complete because yours is incomplete. And this he does know. He knows it in his own being and its experience of his son's experience. The constant going out of his love is blocked when his channels are closed, and he is lonely when the minds he created do not communicate fully with him. Now, there's a little bit of metaphor in here because God can't really be lonely, but we're being told here that, that's how we would feel if we were God. So, again, we don't have to tell God how wonderful he is. He has no ego to accept such praise or perception to judge it. But God's main concern is that we be who we were created to be. His son, his child, himself. And so if we are one with God and we are still stuck in ego, and so our joy is not complete, then God's joy is not complete either, because we're one with God. So as long as we keep ourselves in ego, we're not the complete us who God created us to be. Any questions? Well, okay, let's go to number 7 then. God has kept your kingdom for you, but he cannot share his joy with you until you know it with your whole mind. Revelation is not enough because it is only communication from God. God does not need revelation returned to him, which would clearly be impossible, but he does want it brought to others. This cannot be done with the actual revelation. Its content cannot be expressed because it is intensely personal to the mind that receives it. It can, however, be returned to that mind be returned by that mind to other minds through the abilities the knowledge from the revelation brings. Now, right in the beginning of the book, we talked about revelation. And actually, this whole book is revelation. These ideas are revelation. So very basically, we were created whole and oneness by God sharing his love. But we ourselves had the mad thought of separation and put ourselves into the dream, created the ego. And now we're trying to work our way out of that. We're trying to heal that separation, which is what the atonement is. We're trying to heal that separation. We're trying to unify our minds so that we are, one again. And so that's our purpose in life. Our last paragraph for this chapter. God is praised whenever any mind learns to be wholly helpful. This is impossible without being wholly harmless, because the two beliefs must coexist. The truly helpful are invulnerable because they are not protecting their egos, and so nothing can hurt them. Their helpfulness is their praise of God, and he will return their praise of him because they are like him and they can rejoice together. God goes out to them and through them, and there is great joy throughout the kingdom. Every mind that is changed adds to this joy with its individual willingness to share in it. The truly helpful are God's miracle workers, whom I direct until we all are united in the kingdom, in the joy of the kingdom. I will direct you to wherever you can be truly helpful, and to whoever can follow my guidance through you. So there's another promise from Jesus that he is constantly helping us and guiding us. And again, he's telling us in no uncertain terms what our mission is. Our mission is to be harmless and helpful. And he's telling us that by being truly helpful, we are invulnerable because we're not protecting our egos anymore. We're dissipating the ego. So it can't be there to hurt us. God goes out to them and through them, those of us who are truly helpful and loving and great, and there is great joy throughout the kingdom. The truly helpful are God's miracle workers, whom I direct until we are all united in the joy of the kingdom. And that's the end of this chapter. So let's open it up. Anyone? Eileen?
this is challenging.
It is.
The language is problematic in terms of using words that shouldn't apply based on the concepts that are being delivered. So that's challenging right there.
Yes.
And, this idea that somehow you're not vulnerable if you're on the right track doesn't always turn out that way. I don't know. It's a struggle. I like it. I like the idea. And even being exactly clear, where do I get this help from? Does it show up as a thought so I know where to go next, who to talk to next? I'm just struggling to figure out exactly how to.
I understand. I understand. One of the major concepts that we need to learn is that we are not our bodies. We are spiritual beings. The bodies are ego concepts. Spiritual beings have no individual bodies. And so that's one of the biggest lessons that you need to learn on this journey. You are not your body. So when it says that, we're invulnerable, we're talking about our spiritual selves. Ego cannot harm our spiritual self. Can the body be harmed? Yes. Why? Because it's part of ego. So ego can hurt the body. It's hurting itself, but it created the body. And that's why people are born and people die in the ego world, because that's an ego function. But our spiritual selves, whom we're trying to reconnect with in our minds, cannot be harmed by ego. And they are invulnerable to anything ego can throw at you.
Okay.
So an example of this is Jesus himself. So they crucified him and they killed his body. And through the whole ordeal, he put up no protest. He didn't try to defend himself. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And he allowed all of that to happen. And then he came back and he showed himself and he said, uh-oh, I'm still here. They may have killed my body, but they did not kill me because I was not my body. And you're not your body. And they can kill your body, but they can't kill you. They can't harm you.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like, the soul.
Right. Okay, the soul, the spirit.
Yeah.
So, and relating to our discussion earlier about how there's so much, bad things happening in the world to people and all of that. And again, in the ego world, We can try to do whatever we can do. You're trying to help the abusive women. That's great. That's showing your compassion, your love in the ego world. You can help whatever way you can. Doctors, lawyers, anybody who can try to help wherever they can. Those people who are downtrodden and being hurt by ego. I mean, that's great. I mean, Jesus did that too. He was an example. He healed the sick. He made the blind man see. He even, rose Lazarus from the dead. He did all kinds of things. He fed people. He was not without compassion for those people suffering in the ego world, but he also knew that wasn't, that all that he could do was not going to fix it all in the ego world. And usually when somebody was healed, he said, I didn't heal you. It was your faith that healed you. He said that over and over again. It is your faith that healed you. In other words, it is your belief in your own spiritual self, your faith in your own godness that healed you. He was just an instrument, a conduit for the energy in the ego world. But the true healing came from God. So that's why I said in the past, the only true good that we can do is spiritual good. That does not mean that you don't help where you can. I mean, obviously, if I see an old lady fall down in the street and is in distress, I'm not going to say that, oh, bless you, dear, and walk away. No, I'm going to help her whatever I can. Help her get up, call 911, whatever I can do to help, I'm going to do in the ego world. But at the same time, I'm going to be praying for her, acknowledging that she's a spiritual being, asking Spirit to send her light and love and healing and forgiveness, because I know that that's the true solution to the problem. But that doesn't mean I'm going to ignore the ego problem. And so all of us, I'm sure, are that same way. We would all help anyone we possibly can, given the situation. But those situations don't come along that often, is the thing. I haven't seen a little old lady fall down in the street that I could help in forever. But that doesn't stop my daily practice of holding all of those people who need help in the light and sending love and energy spiritually to them. That I can do every day, all the day, as much as I can do it, without having the specific ego situations being brought to my attention. And that's the point I want to make. Again, I'm not diminishing or disregarding all of the pain and suffering that people go through in this world. I'm just saying that the most effective way to deal with it is spiritually. And if you can help in the ego world, then by all means do so. Anyone? Well, all right then. I thank you all for joining me this evening. Let us have a moment of silence, please.